Zipper rolls out to the right, pitches off to Taylor, and Taylor's to the 20, down to the 15, down to 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Touchdown, Billy Taylor! Touchdown, Billy Taylor! Billy Taylor scored a touchdown from 21 yards out. The crowd goes berserk. It was November 22nd, 1969. That they came to Barry, Michigan, all dressed in maize and blue. The words were said, the prayers were read, and everybody cried. But when they closed the coffin, there was someone else inside. Oh, they came to Barry, Michigan, but Michigan wasn't dead. And when the game was over, it was someone else instead. 11 Michigan Wolverines put on the gloves of gray, and as the organ played the victors, they laid Woody Hayes away. Under center is Wangler at the 45. He goes back. He's looking for a receiver. He throws downfield to Carter. Who's got it better than us? Nobody!
Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue, and welcome to our Michigan Game Day show as we prepare for Saturday night's interstate clash with Michigan State. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Our guest today is Isaiah Hole from USA Today's WolverinesWire and host of the LockedOn Wolverines Podcast. He'll join us in just a few minutes. First, my view from Section 17 and a few thoughts from Blake Corum and Coach Harbaugh. Some of us are surprised that after what happened last year, this is still a night game. I'm sure it's because NBC also knows what happened and wants the ratings. From what we're hearing, a lot of Michigan State fans have sold their tickets this week, and I think that means you'll see a lot more maize and blue in the crowd than you normally would for this game. So have both teams forgotten about the tunnel incident? Both teams are publicly saying they've moved past that, but in the locker rooms of each team, you know they are talking about it. The Spartans' troubles off the field with Mel Tucker's firing have been well documented. So has their lackluster play on the field. No matter, this is their Super Bowl and always has been. It's evident they do not have the talent Michigan does. Rest assured they will be ready to rock on Saturday night. The key in this game, especially a rivalry game with an inferior opponent, is to jump out fast and suck the life right out of them. We can't start like we did last week against Indiana. If we do, and give this Spartan team hope they can hang around, it could get dicey. I don't think that will happen because this Michigan team seems to have a different focus from the last two teams. I expect them to get after it from the get-go and do their boa constrictor thing with glee to this Spartan team. Earlier this week, Blake Corum said he wants his last game against the Spartans to be one to remember.
Living in the state now, you get the bragging rights the rest of the year if you win. And if you lose, you got to wait a whole nother year. And where I'm at, this is my last year. It's important that I go out with a bang against them, It's important that I finalize the stamp. I thought I finalized it last year, but I didn't.
Blake said he was very happy to see his running back mate Donovan Edwards get his first touchdown last week.
Seeing him get in for the first time was great. And like I told him, I said the first one is the hardest one. Just like back in high school, the first offer was the hardest offer to get. After that, they just start trickling. They start trickling. So you got the first one, now watch what happens.
Coach Jim Harbaugh was once again this week singing the praises of his quarterback, J.J. McCarthy.
Actually, I feel like I stand corrected from what I said, what I've been saying the last several months, which is I think J.J.'s a once-in-a-generation quarterback. J.J. has shown to be on path to be the best quarterback in Michigan history. The statistics, I'm sure, speak to that. And the statistic that speaks to it the most is amount of drives. He's had 213 drives. We've scored on 130 of those drives. 96 have been touchdowns, 34 field goals, 61%. So it's really remarkable. There's no statistic that demonstrates the quality of quarterback play more than that statistic in my mind.
My guest today says he expects Michigan to start fast and keep the foot on the gas all night against the Spartans. Up next is Isaiah Hole from the WolverinesWire. So stay with us. With us on the show today is Isaiah Hole, who covers all things Michigan for WolverinesWire and has that great podcast, LockedOn Wolverines. Isaiah, great to get you back on the show with us.
Absolutely. It's always my pleasure, Mike.
Another week of, when we look back at last Saturday, I guess nitpicking after a victory, when looking for things that went wrong, Jim Harbaugh pointed out the run game needs to get better, especially after Indiana. 17 of 32 rush plays from backs went for 3 yards or less. And as he said, that's one aspect of the game that still has to be better down the stretch, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that you're going to see teams putting more of a premium this year than they did last year on trying to take away the run game, right? Because last year it seemed like there was more of a onus to take away the pass game once teams realized what J.J. McCarthy could do through the air. However, weirdly, I think that that's kind of gone the other way now, where teams kind of want J.J. McCarthy to try to beat them, even though he's shown that he is more than willing to oblige them in that. But last year, we certainly saw teams backing off their safeties and their linebackers a little bit, whereas this year they're keeping them closer to the line of scrimmage. And I think that with what you saw from TCU and saw what J.J. McCarthy and his kind of errancy in that game. I mean, obviously he still threw for 343 yards with the 2 pick sixes. I think that's made teams say, okay, we're just going to live or die by trying to just keep that run game at bay and not get beat that way. And maybe JJ makes some mistakes, but as the Bowling Green game showed you, kind of doesn't matter, right? If JJ makes some mistakes, chances are that Michigan's still going to beat you. So I think that's probably a big reason why maybe people aren't as excitable this year, is because we kind of got accustomed to this Michigan team running all over everybody. That said, I mean, if you look back at 2021 and the stats, it's not terribly different than this year, with the exception of like a handful of games, right? Like the Washington game, Michigan ran all over Washington. But then it just kind of was in this, like, okay, Michigan's going to run for like 150 yards a game. It wasn't necessarily like this, wasn't like what it was last year. And then Jim Harbaugh even kind of said, last week, like, or maybe it was even this week, time all kind of runs together in the season, that, these big breakouts, the way that Michigan did last year, that was the anomaly. So, I mean, the run game's still working, and it takes some pressure off of J.J. McCarthy. It might not be as explosive as it was, say, last year. Just like the overall explosive plays last year weren't as big as in 2021. Michigan was the most explosive team offensively in the country, but the offense still took a big step forward last year. This year, when you look at the offensive numbers, they're not eye-popping, but they haven't really needed to be. And what you look at from the last couple games, what's been interesting to me is more that Michigan hasn't really put together maybe one complete game in the Nebraska game. And even that wasn't necessarily crazy, right? They're not going to put up 600 yards in a game. What's crazy to me is that they can score 45, 52 type points and have 400 yards offense in a game. That they can make the most out of what they get. They can play complementary football. They can play field position. They can get turnovers. The turnovers are obviously what's really aiding this team along. This is kind of what we've been waiting for defensively for several years, and we're finally starting to see it for the first time since, say, 2016. So I think that the complementary football of it all is kind of dictated that what we're seeing from this Michigan team isn't flashy, but they've had games like this Indiana game where it feels like, man, Michigan's not playing well, and they still won 52-7. Michigan wasn't playing well in the Jim Harbaugh left games, right? The first 3 weeks of the season,
right,
and still quitting in the 30s to a single digit. That's been the case all year thus far, and it's not dissimilar from what we saw even last year, because people really weren't feeling like Michigan had put together a complete game until they got to the bigger games of the season. And so they got to that Penn State game, and then suddenly you saw Michigan kind of turn it on, and the game went the way it went. So I think that's kind of what we're looking at. And I think with the backloaded schedule, that maybe we'll start to see things look a little bit more, I don't want to say crisp, because things have been mostly crisp in general. It's just maybe, they're not breaking out big runs. Like you said, they have a lot of 3-yard runs. Donovan Edwards is not quite gotten into form. That said, Donovan Edwards didn't really get into form until week 7 last year against Penn State either. So that's not necessarily new either. So things are kind of going the way they're supposed to go. And, the last couple of years, it's been Michigan really turning things on against the bigger teams they've played. They haven't played any bigger teams yet. So we'll see what happens kind of from here on out.
But with 5 games left, do you think this offensive line can and still needs to be better in that run and even pass blocking aspect of the game?
Well, I do want to clarify. Jim didn't really say that the offensive line got outplayed as much as he said that Indiana brought more bodies than what they had available. So that's what teams are kind of doing, is they're trying to overload things. And it doesn't matter how good your offensive line is if you've got 5 people up front, or you've got 7, depending on the tight ends, and the other team brings 2 or 3 more guys. It doesn't really matter how good they are. If the team's bringing 11 and you've got 6 there, then you're going to lose that battle if you don't have some kind of contingency. Michigan has the contingencies, which is the good news, right? Like, as Jim Harbaugh even noted, the one JJ, the touchdown, one of the touchdowns, I believe it was the Colston Loveland one he was pointing out. They had so-called lost that battle because Indiana brought more pressure than Michigan had blockers. Mm-hmm. But that allows for things like guys open downfield, not having that extra help. If Indiana had the safety help, then Colston Loveland wouldn't have been able to just outrun the linebacker that was on him and being able to score a touchdown, right? So it's kind of a give or take, right? Like, understanding what you have available to you. If another team is going to bring extra guys, well, that means that you have opportunities down the field, but you have to be able to get it off, and that means being able to roll things out the way that JJ McCarthy can, and or being able to just take advantage of those things. I don't think the offensive line is in a bad spot at all. I think the offensive line is playing great. I thought that it maybe struggled in the first 2 weeks, and then I thought it started to look a heck of a lot better after that, and it's continued to. It's just a matter of some teams they're gonna roll the dice and say, maybe we can get home quick enough. And certainly the pass protection broke down a couple times. There was the 4 sacks. We haven't seen that all year. And so Michigan's going to have to adjust, because other teams are going to say, okay, maybe we can get them behind the chains if we overload. And that's going to certainly cause some issues. But as a result of that, that's why we saw some big busts by Indiana. I expect more teams to probably continue to try to do things like that. And I expect Michigan to continually adjust. It might not always look that pretty as a result, as Michigan tries to figure out, like, okay, how can we take advantage of this situation? But that's going to be the gamble that teams, have. As Michigan going up against TCU last year, it learned some lessons as teams have tried to, have the 3-3-5. You could see that in play against Nebraska, right? So. Mm-hmm. Michigan learns its lessons, but you just hope that when you get to Penn State, when you get to Ohio State, if you can get back to the college football playoff, that you're not learning a lesson for the first time and that you can adjust quickly. And I think the offensive line has done a really pretty good job of doing that. And in week 1, when East Carolina overloaded the line and said, you're not going to run against us, you're going to have to pass, Michigan said, okay, fine, we want to run, but we can throw for 280 yards with JJ McCarthy regardless. If Michigan can continue to take advantage of what defenses give them, then they'll be fine, as long as they don't try to get too cute, continue to play their game. You might see games in which the run game isn't working and the pass game is, and vice versa. It's just a matter of taking what the defense is going to give you, and that's, I think, the more important thing than having the 250 yards rushing that we have become accustomed to.
Well, that's right. And I think a big part of that is J.J. McCarthy is in complete command of this offense. And, when you listen to Jim Harbaugh talk about him, pretty evident he loves his quarterback. But again, he is mentioning or has said things to the effect that J.J. is on track to be the best Michigan quarterback ever. And I know he's said things like that before, but he's saying it more often now. He really believes it, doesn't he?
He absolutely does, and I think it's hard to disagree. I mean, JJ makes, he's very accurate. You're seeing now mid-season kind of what is starting to fall apart to some degree. I mean, maybe it's also because they're not really trying to force things deep the way that they were last year at this time. But JJ's taking what's there. He's making plays, and the receivers and tight ends are tending to come down with the football. But I mean, he's got the second best accuracy in all of college football. Would that number go down if he was attempting more passes? Maybe, but I mean, you're seeing a guy that's just in command. And as Jim Harbaugh said after the Nebraska game, even when it looks like things are maybe a little more like, I guess what you would think of as like a runaway train, like it was like when Tate Fortier was the quarterback, right?
Yeah.
That's not the case here. Like it might look at times like, things are falling apart, but JJ still has full command, and that's where you're seeing him going down and making plays like these touchdowns to Roman Wilson in the Nebraska game. The runs against Minnesota, the flips to Donovan Edwards, in the Indiana game, has still full control, and he's making plays. He's keeping his eyes downfield. He's reading defenses. He's making smart decisions, and I think he's right in the sense of we haven't necessarily seen someone that's had the level of command of the offense the way that J.J. McCarthy has. Certainly, we've seen bigger numbers. John Navarre, Chad Henne, people of that nature have put up bigger numbers than JJ has, but JJ is doing what it takes to win and doing it in a very controlled fashion, and I think that's the most important thing. So again, I want to see it more though against Michigan State, Penn State, Ohio State. I think that's going to be the thing that really tells us just how good JJ McCarthy is, right? Because they're going to face, I mean, not against Michigan State, but certainly against Penn State and Ohio State, they're going to face better defenses than they've seen all year. You don't have a Wisconsin or an Iowa on the schedule this year, so it's kind of difficult to really ascertain just how much the offense is taking advantage of defenses that are really, truly elite. But at the same time, I mean, Nebraska was probably, and Minnesota as well, were probably your two best opportunities, right? I mean, Nebraska had the top-rated run defense in the conference and one of the top run defenses in the country, and no one had eclipsed 56 yards on the ground. Granted, none of those offenses that they faced were necessarily offenses that were planning to run the ball that much, except for Minnesota when Nebraska faced them. And yet Michigan ran the ball kind of with impunity. I know that's kind of diverging from the JJ thing, but at the same time, I want to see what JJ does if you get against Penn State, a team that has been really, really good across the board defensively. If Michigan can't run the ball, what can JJ McCarthy do? And so far, what we know is that he can go out there and make plays kind of regardless. We just have to see it in the bigger games to really know for sure. But he is certainly on that trajectory, as Jim Harbaugh said.
We certainly are going to find out in the next 5 weeks. But, when you look at the offense in its totality right now, do you think we've seen the best from this unit, or is the best yet to come?
It's the best is certainly yet to come. We've yet to see this offense. Like we still don't even know who like a third receiver is at this point, right? Like it's like I could also share that. I mean, Michigan is keeping things relatively close to the vest still, right? This is the little inside info that I've given on my podcast is that there is another gear, maybe even a whole next level to this offense that has yet to be unveiled, because Michigan's not stupid. It knows who they're facing right now, right? They don't. When we've seen this before, they have no need to really dig into the bag that much. And even though you're seeing a little, you're seeing your weekly flea flicker, you saw the reverse flea flicker. That there's no mistake that came against Rutgers, because Michigan believed that Rutgers was the toughest team that they were going to face, particularly defensively, until they got to the Penn State game. So they maybe pulled out, a handful of plays that are a broader part of the offense, but otherwise they've just kind of been in a shell. They've been in base offense for the most part. They haven't really felt the need to really show what they're capable of, show many things that are in the system. I don't even expect to see that open up until they get to that Penn State game. And then I think at that point, you're going to start to see things look different. Think back to 2018. I know it's a different staff outside of Jim and Jay Harbaugh, but 2018, everyone kind of had a beat on what they thought Michigan was, and no one thought that they were going to emerge from the gauntlet unscathed. And then yet, suddenly, as they're playing what was a really good Wisconsin team that just about everyone picked to beat Michigan, when they're hosting them for a night game, suddenly the offense looks completely different. And it did for those next couple games. I mean, even the Ohio State game, the offense looked different. It got overshadowed by a terrible defensive performance. So I would expect that once you get to the end of the season, it's going to be something very similar where suddenly people are going to say, where was that all this time? Well, Michigan didn't need it, right? Like Michigan scoring 52 points without having to do that. So what's the point of breaking out something if you don't necessarily need it? Save those things. Jim Harbaugh is certainly a gamesman. He's going to keep things close to the vest and then unveil things when the time is necessary. And then that's when you're going to see things suddenly look a lot different. And if they get to that Penn State game and that Ohio State game and they still don't feel like they have to show anything, like they might slow roll it, you know, they might show you like a play or two. And if the defense suddenly comes away with a couple pick sixes, guess what? They'll keep things close to the vest until it's needed to kind of unveil things. That's kind of how this team is structured. So that's the good news. They haven't felt like they've really needed to dig into the bag. I believe that there is a heck of a lot more to this offense than what we've seen to this point. And you're going to see a lot more once they get to those bigger games, unless they, do a dive play in the first play of the game from Penn State, score a 75-yard touchdown, and then the defense gets a pick six and they're up 14-0. Then suddenly they're going to be like, okay, well, we'll just continue to just kind of hold these things in the bag, and we'll see when we actually need them.
Well, I think one of the big reasons, the biggest reason we have not had to show much, I mean, it's because of our defense. And I've always been a defense-first guy. I really do believe, even in this modern era of college football, that defense still wins championships. So I love watching our guys play. And, starting up front, including the edge guys, the depth we have is so impressive, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, I still want to see more production from the edge in particular, but they're getting the production from the interior, which is something we haven't been able to say since 2017. I think that even last 2 years when it's been Chris Jenkins, Mozzie Smith, I mean, that was good. This is better. That's been what's really, really phenomenal. And I mean, Indiana had a really smart plan with the new offensive coordinator. Michigan really had no idea what it was going to get. And it's kind of like Mike Elston even said going into the game of, we're seeing offenses completely change for us, right? Like they're not doing what we've seen them do when they get to us. So they really have had no idea what to expect in general. And yet, I thought Indiana had a really smart plan. I mean, you could count to one and their quarterback was getting rid of the ball. That opened up some things in the run game as well, because they had to cover all 53 and, yards of the width of the field, because it just didn't really matter what the formation was. They were getting rid of the ball one way or another within 1.5 seconds, kind of like clockwork. And that worked for a quarter, like you said. And then Michigan clamped down and they're going to make adjustments. And that's, I think, the best thing about what Michigan's able to do is that it's not even necessarily taking till halftime that they're making adjustments. But then, like last year, it's kind of funny. It feels like at these press conferences, it's the same questions as last year. Why has Jesse Minter been so good in the second half? Well, he was last year too, and sometimes these adjustments are coming in the second quarter. It seems more often than not that they are. So but teams are not able to really do anything until, Michigan's got their third and fourth stringers out there at this point. Now you can go ahead and move the ball down the field outside of maybe the first drive or two. It's not surprising that they're going to get the best punch kind of early on, right? It does start up front. I do still want to see some better things kind of in the back end. I mean, that said, teams aren't exactly passing all over Michigan either. They're making some NFL caliber throws here and there, and that's going to happen. Has Michigan played a really dynamic pass game yet? I don't know. Certainly some teams, that's what, we've seen Indiana do really well in that, but they took Taven Jackson out of the game for a while. He's their 300-yard passer, yet Brendan Sorsby was how they felt they were going to win that game after the first the first go round with Taven Jackson proved that, hey, that's not going to work. So that's a credit to the guys up front. One of the questions someone asked me in the mailbag for the line was about the linebackers. They said, why aren't we hearing about the linebackers very much? It's like, well, because they're doing their job. And it's kind of like Michigan hasn't had the need of a Devin Bush type guy that's going to run the guy down, going one side of the field to the other. The linebackers are all in position and they're just doing their jobs. And that's kind of just the general everything when it comes to the defense. And I think the most impressive thing, honestly, is the active hands that we're seeing. You're seeing a guy like Braden McGregor. Seems like every game he's deflecting a pass.
Yeah.
Right? He's not necessarily getting sacks, but he's impacting the game in other ways. Seems like every game you're seeing every single defensive tackle burst through the line and create some kind of havoc. I mean, like literally all 5 guys that are in that rotation are having their moment. We're talking about Cam Good against Minnesota. We're talking about Rayshon Benny across a couple different games. Weirdly, the one guy we're not talking about a lot is Chris Jenkins, and that's because he's helping create opportunities for those other guys by demanding so much attention. And even then, he's had an interception. Kenneth Grant had a chance to tie the team with the most interceptions this last week. He's been an absolute beast. Mason Graham, out with injury for 2 weeks, comes in like a wrecking ball as soon as he comes back and has a wrecking ball on his hands, keeping him from being at full strength. I mean, this has been impressive. I just want to see more from the edge guys. You are seeing Josiah Stewart taking that step forward. Jalen Harrell has already taken that step forward. Derek Moore is looking more and more impressive. Braden McGregor's got the active hands, and yet it still feels like there's something more that can be gained there. But that's also because, like I said earlier, there's nothing you can do when a team is taking the snap, counting to 1, and making sure the ball was out of their hands. There's literally nothing you can do against that, except for just finding ways to adjust, continuing to have pressure, and then keeping everything in front of you. And Michigan's done that. So, I mean, it's as impressive of a group as really it could be.
No, absolutely. And we spent a lot of time talking about those guys up front, and they deserve that. And, I know there are still folks that worry about the back end, that we have to get better production back there. I think with the injuries clearing up, that's going to happen. But the linebacking group, as you said, we don't hear that much about them because they're doing their job, and kudos to Coach Partridge. But the guy I'd like to talk about is Michael Barrett. Watching him, and he's grading out week after week as one of the best linebackers in college football. He's been that good, hasn't he?
I mean, who would have thought that a year ago,
yeah.
Right? Like, it was around this time last year that he started to kind of ascend. It was that Ohio State game forward that he suddenly, for the last 3 games, became really a force. But now, yeah, he's blowing things up. He's everywhere you want to be. A lot of these times you do see, he might be a little bit of the exception to the rule about running a guy down, because it seems like you see those quarterbacks get rid of the ball really fast, and it looks like they have an open guy, and before you know it, Michael Barrett's all over him. But then you don't see him for very long because the rotation has allowed, Ernest Hausman to also get involved, and I think what that's kind of a credit to is just the depth on this team and keeping guys fresh. One of the funniest things I think was just on Twitter. There's this Buckeye fan account, Athletes in Space, that quote tweeted the PFF College tweet where they noted that Michael Barrett led all Big Ten linebackers this last week, and Athletes in Space responds saying, "How is Michigan doing this?" Right? This is a former quarterback that it's taken him all this time, and suddenly he's just this absolute force. What Michigan is doing is developing, and yes, it's taken him 5.5 years into his career, and you would hope that if someone's around for as long as Michael Barrett is, that they would develop. But finally, it was kind of more of like, he came in and he was a quarterback. They converted him to safety, and then they made him a Viper, and then they eliminated the Viper position. It makes sense that he wouldn't develop because his role just kind of constantly changed. And once they finally settled in halfway through the 2021 season and said, "You are a will linebacker, so this is what you are going to do. This is what our defense is. It's not going to change. You can focus on this role." it took him a little bit, but then it worked, and he's developed, and he's really stepped up in that light. So that has allowed Michigan to really just the consistency of the defense and being able to say, you are in this role, just continue in this role. That's allowed him to develop. And now Michigan, what they're getting is what teams like Ohio State used to always get. It wasn't just the 5 stars at Ohio State that were developing. It was their 3 stars and their 4 stars. Michigan's getting that now, and they have less 5 stars, but everybody's developing, right? You look across the defense, and everyone's an NFL caliber player, right? Everyone. There's no one on that defense that you could look and say, well, yeah, he's a great college player, but he's probably not going to play in the league. I mean, even a guy like Mike Sainristil, who's a little bit smaller, he's such a complete football player. You're like, well, he has to be able to go to the league. You know, just that's what Michigan's defense is. Every single guy that's contributing right now, every single one is an NFL caliber player. And it doesn't really matter if they were a 5-star, if they were a 3-star. You know, they have those all across. And it's all, I think, a big credit to the guys who know what their role is. They know what the defense is. They know not just what they're doing, they know the why they're doing it. And that's allowed them all to play fast and smart. And Michael Barrett, I think, is kind of, he and Mikey Sainristil are the poster child for those. It's poster children for them. So it's kind of a credit just to everything from top down, from the scheme, the coaching, and it funnels down to the players, and players taking full advantage of what they're being given. And that Michael Barrett is one of the key guys in that.
Well, it's a beautiful thing to watch, and we know on both sides of the ball we're in a good place right now. And then here we go Saturday night, travel to East Lansing for a night game coast to coast at Spartan Stadium, and we all know what's been happening around that program this year. Still, I mean, I've been around for a long time watching this series. I'm on high alert. I know the staff's on high alert because this will be and always has been the Super Bowl for Michigan State.
Yeah, if their name was Purdue, we wouldn't have a second thought about it, right?
Right.
Like, I mean, honestly, their name is Michigan State, and they're worse in just about every metric compared to Nebraska and Minnesota. And I don't think there was high concern for either of those teams, or Indiana, for that matter. Indiana's worse than Michigan State. I should note that. I'm not saying they're on the even plane, but certainly Minnesota and Nebraska are hovering around the same type of stats across the board. But you're going to get the fight from them, and you know that there's going to be, as much as Michigan State fans like to pretend like they are the paragons of morality and Michigan is some evil empire, it really is reverse that. That the dirty shots are going to come from Michigan State, not vice versa. So there are reasons to be on high alert. You don't know what they have saved up that maybe Michigan's going to go in and pretty much do what it does, because it's going to say, okay, this is what they are, and we're going to do what we do. Whereas Michigan State is probably going to have some things saved up, even with Harlan Barnett leading the charge now. Like, there's going to be some things that we see that are different, and they're going to give Michigan its best shot right out the gate. They always do. They did in 2016. They took the early lead. They didn't last year. They took an early lead. But all things considered, Michigan State does not have the talent. If this Michigan State team makes it a real game against this Michigan team, that's a failure on Michigan more than anything, because as much as it kind of felt like that going into the week 2 of 2020, ultimately that Michigan team wasn't very good, and it just was masked by beating a not very good Michigan State team. Sorry, not Michigan State team, but Minnesota team to open up the season. And this is different, right? We've seen 6 Michigan State games and 7 Michigan games. We know what this Michigan team is, regardless of the fact that it hasn't played a high caliber team. Michigan State at the moment is not a high caliber team, and as much as Mel Tucker was saying before the season, this is the most talent that Michigan State has had, I literally laughed at Big Ten Media Days when he said that and immediately tweeted out that he said that, because I looked at their roster and said, this is the worst Michigan State team from a talent perspective that I can recall. And certainly since I've been covering the team, I don't think this is even as talented of a Michigan State team any of their kind of down years, 2016, 2018, 2019. I think that this is a Michigan State team that is completely bereft of talent outside of a handful of guys who have yet to develop. You look at that 5-star defensive end that they got from Texas A&M, and you say, well, on paper that guy's really good, but he has not moved into that role. And then the guys that are relatively good for them, I still don't think that they are upper echelon talent, like Cal Halliday or a Jacoby Widgeon. They're horrible mismatches when it comes to playing against Michigan. So could they make it interesting? Absolutely. Any given Saturday, any team could. But when you look at this, any other year, you could look at Michigan State's roster and say, well, they still have a handful of guys that would start for Michigan if they were to transfer over. I don't think that they have a single player right now that could. Maybe their kicker or punter, but even then it's a push for the most part, right? I think it's one of those things where Michigan will take their guy, Michigan State will take their guy, right? But ultimately, there is no point on offense, defense, bulk of special teams. Maybe again Tyrell Henry as a punt returner, just because Michigan hasn't settled in on a guy. But would you take him over Tyler Morris after you've seen some of the returns he's had? I wouldn't,
No,
right?
no.
I would say you like what Tyler Morris has done, even though he's kind of platooned at the position. So it really then comes down to motivation. Michigan State is very well going to come in motivated, but so too is Michigan. They can sit there and say up and down, we aren't thinking about the tunnel incident last year. Okay, you can say that. That's more so to keep themselves from providing bulletin board material. But once they're out there, of course they're going to be thinking about what happened at the end of last year. They're going to be way angry. And as much as, again, Michigan State fans like to pretend like that was all some weird, wild conspiracy started by Jim Harbaugh and that Jamon Green was actually in the tunnel yapping his mouth, which is antithetical to who Jamon Green actually was and is and everything. It's those players in the MSU locker room know what really happened. Players in the Michigan locker room know what really happened. The fans can sit there and think, whatever they want. Those guys that are in the Michigan State locker room, they know exactly how that went down, and it went down exactly how Michigan said it went down. And I know that because I got a full account of it before I even got to the post-game press conference, of exactly how it went down from people who were further up the tunnel when it happened. I was down at the base of the tunnel. So that's certainly going to play a role, right? You're going to have angry Michigan players that are better than those Michigan State players that are going to want to show how angry they are. The only things that really change the complexion of the game are what things has Michigan State done to that Michigan hasn't seen that could take advantage of what, of just the ignorance, from a play calling perspective, offensively. That's one end. And then any potential cheap shots, and I hope it doesn't happen, right? Michigan needs to emerge from this game healthy. What potential cheap shots could happen? Cheap shots happen every time. So if Michigan has to keep those at bay, and if it does well to weather whatever storm it faces in the early going, mixed with keeping your head on a swivel, then Michigan will be just fine.
I just get nervous in this being a rivalry game, having been around it for decades now, that I think the key Saturday night is what it always is. When you're playing a team with inferior talent, don't give them life. Get on them early. Do not let them hang around and gain confidence.
I think one thing that'll maybe help is that Michigan State's probably lost a little confidence, and so has their fan base, right? Like, if Michigan State would have beaten Rutgers, they would have felt a lot more, the fan base would have felt more like they had a shot, and they would have probably not sold a lot of their tickets to Michigan fans. And I think it's going to be a very friendly environment for Michigan, kind of like it was in like 2016. This probably is going to be much more so than that. But nonetheless, like, we've seen a killer instinct that maybe hasn't existed on the road from this Michigan team. And I understand the last 2 years have happened, but this is different, right? Michigan, when I was standing on the sidelines at Nebraska, looking up at their crowd, their stadium is very impressive. It's not a dissimilar stadium from Ohio Stadium, but for whatever reason, I like it a lot more, and it feels bigger, even though it's smaller. It just feels a little bit more daunting.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember looking at it and just kind of suddenly having that kind of pit in my stomach, like, oh, I don't know how Michigan's going to overcome this. Now, Nebraska wasn't. We're learning Nebraska might be a little bit better than we thought. They certainly should have beaten Minnesota, and they've won a couple other games. They've had their struggles as well, but I could see Nebraska being a bowl game, and certainly they're being projected to be one, right? But with both Nebraska and Minnesota, Michigan went out in both those games and said, nope, your crowd is not going to get into this game. We are going to dominate you from the jump. And that, as much as we look at the last couple of years, is not exactly – Michigan's had success on the road where it hadn't before, but it hasn't dominated on the road like it has. They didn't fully dominate Iowa last year. They did a really good job, and they won handily, ultimately. Iowa made it interesting near the end. But, Michigan got out to the 20-0 lead. That feels like insurmountable to Iowa, but Iowa actually also didn't take that for an answer. Indiana, that was a fight going into, in the half. Certainly there were extenuating circumstances with the Mike Hart situation. But, Michigan still found itself in a fight and had to pull the cat out of the bag a little bit in the second half in order to kind of pull away. Ohio State last year, Michigan kind of did have them where they wanted them in the sense of, they wanted to dare J.J. McCarthy to do what what he was able to do. And then he did. And then they had to back off from stopping the run. And then Michigan did what it was capable of doing, even though that was, a halftime lead by Ohio State. That was certainly where Michigan wanted them to be. Defensively, Michigan obviously also had its typical second half clampdown. You go back the year before, Wisconsin was a close game going into the fourth quarter. I know Michigan was dominating that game for the most part, and it did not look like Michigan was going to lose that game. But that was a close game going into the fourth quarter. The Nebraska game came down to the wire. The Penn State game came down to the wire, and that wasn't a good Penn State team. This Michigan team went on the road and said, we're not going to even let you even think you have a chance for a second against either Nebraska and Minnesota. And outside of Rutgers and Maryland, Michigan hasn't done that to Big Ten teams on the road. Michigan has tended to play down to competition. This team doesn't do that. This team, even in the non-conference with the kind of unimpressive scores, Michigan just kind of, as Joe Klatt said, became a boa constrictor. And that's what they've done to every team. And the evidence of that isn't just what your eyes are seeing, but what you're hearing from opposing coaches. You didn't hear that much from Tom Allen, and I think that speaks more to just the Indiana media. But I've never heard a opposing coach talk as glowingly about Michigan as I have both Matt Rule and PJ Fleck, who are just kind of like, we're not even going to talk about what our team didn't do. We're just going to sit there and tell you about how amazing Michigan is. Because wow. Like, I have never heard that before in my 9 years of covering this team. Ever. Right? Like, it's always been a failure of what other teams have done, right? James Franklin came out of the 2016 Michigan game being like, we really laid an egg. It wasn't just Michigan was so good. It was, we really laid an egg. And to some degree, he might not have been wrong fully. This Michigan team's just built different. And I don't really expect there to be a letdown in the sense of this Michigan team is so focused. I'll tell you how focused they are. Minnesota shares like an entrance to the field from the photographers and the road team.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime that I walked by a Michigan, like if I was walking up or down the tunnel pregame, I walked by a guy. Normally when you go on the road, you have a lot more conversations, seems a little bit looser and everything like that. I might talk to some coaches and stuff like that. Guys wouldn't even look me in the eye, and that wasn't because they were afraid of me. They were just that dialed in. It was like, really? That's what it was. They were so locked in, they weren't even going to acknowledge anything outside of their bubble. And then you saw what happened. That's how I feel like this Michigan team just is in general. They're just when they come off the bus, maybe they're a little bit more likely to, okay, like, hey, how's it going? But once they get dressed, suddenly everything changes. I don't expect that to change just because it's Michigan State this year. Other years, you didn't really know what you're going to get out of Michigan because a lot of times they went in a little overconfident. I don't think that's the case of this team.
No, I agree with you. I think they are a very focused team in a different way, and I don't think there's going to be any kind of an issue Saturday night. Still, can't wait for the game. Final question before we let you get away, though, Isaiah. We know what lies ahead for Michigan football in November, but this week we get to see, a titanic matchup between Penn State and Ohio State down in the shoe. What are your vibes about that game?
I really don't know what to expect. Ohio State certainly is looking a little bit better with Kyle McCord at the helm the last couple of weeks. Maryland certainly had its opportunities and didn't take advantage of them, and that bit Maryland, right? Like when a team's as talented as Ohio State is, talent is going to win out if you don't take advantage, right? Penn State has kind of looked pretty good in moments. I wouldn't say they're quite as good as what people are talking about them as looking. That said, Ohio State's offense has not done well against the better defenses it's played. I mean, and that even includes Indiana, right? I know that's week one, new quarterback, and they were on the road, but they only mustered 23 points against Indiana, and it took them all game to get there. They play a similar defense in Notre Dame, and they only muster 17 points. It took them all game to get there. They play an improved Maryland defense that is still probably isn't an upper echelon Big Ten defense, but it's a better defense than what Maryland has tended to field. And they got 37 points, but it took them all game to get there. I don't think that they have all game to get there against Penn State. That said, I also don't know. I feel a little bit better about Penn State's offense because they were able to take advantage of the Iowa defense, which we do know the Iowa defense is still elite. They're ranked number 1 in SP+. I feel a little bit better about Penn State's offense, even though it hasn't necessarily been consistent. The game is in the shoe, which Penn State has not done a very good job of. James Franklin, outside of one game in his career, has not been able to fully take advantage of Ohio State and everything. But I think if there's going to be a year in which they can do it, it's this one. We don't know what Ohio State players are going to be playing. It sounds like Travion Henderson and Emeka Egbuka and a couple others are still pretty banged up. Ohio State's defense certainly looks improved, but is it as good as Iowa? I don't know. This one, to me, kind of wouldn't surprise me. I think it's going to be a close game one way or the other. I still honestly don't think that either team is in the same conversation with Michigan as much as people want to put them there. But I really think it's going to be a really good game. It's the only reason I'm happy that the Michigan State game is a night game is because it will allow me to watch the entirety of that one. And I could see either team winning. I think this is Penn State's best shot in a long time over Ohio State. And I think that they've had Ohio State circled on the calendar more than they have Michigan, even as James Franklin's making veiled shots at Michigan lately. I just think Penn State is built better to take on Ohio State, right? That is what James Franklin has long been building to. That's what their talent is. Having that Keelan King versus Marvin Harrison Jr., there are going to be times where one or the other gets the best of the other, and it's going to vary on a down-by-down basis. I don't know that Ohio State's pass rush is good enough to take advantage of what I still think is not a great Penn State offensive line, but I do think that Penn State's pass rush is good enough to take advantage of what I think is not a good Ohio State offensive line. I think that is where the battle is going to be determined more than anything. So I give Penn State a slight edge, but it wouldn't surprise me if Ohio State managed to come away with a close victory.
I agree with you. I think it's going to be a good game down in the shoe, and we'll see what happens, but that will clear things up a lot in the Big Ten East, so stay tuned. You're right. Great to watch that game because we don't kick off until the evening, so enjoy it. Here with us today on the show has been Isaiah Hole, who covers, as I said, all things Michigan for WolverinesWire and hosts that great LockedOn Wolverines podcast. Isaiah, always great having you on the show with us. You're a great guest, and we thank you and look forward to our next visit.
Absolutely. It's always my pleasure, Mike.
On Quick Hits today, no real injury updates this week. As has been the case this season, Michigan will release their availability updates sometime on Saturday. Here are some game day notes of interest for you. We lead the series with 72 wins against 38 losses. There have been 5 ties. The first meeting was on October 12th of 1898 in Ann Arbor, 8-39-10 Michigan win. Last year's game was also in Ann Arbor, and remembered best for the tunnel incident, of course, after the game. On the field, we pounded out a 29-7 win. Harlan Barnett is the interim head coach, and his record this season is 0-3. Last year, the Spartans were 5-7 overall, 3-6 in the Big Ten, good for a 5th-place finish in the East. Their last bowl appearance was in the 2021 Peach Bowl, a 31-21 win over Pitt. The weatherman says temps will start out in the upper 40s at game time, falling to the low 40s during the game, and it could be wet, a 40% chance of rain. No worries with the weather for either of these teams. We've played in bad weather games before, and while it can be a factor, I don't think it will be. Michigan is as focused a group as I've seen in a long time. Whatever happens on the field or falls from the skies, I expect we'll handle it just fine. You never know what's going to happen in this game. We've seen some bizarre replay decisions, clock snafus, shaky refereeing over the years, among other things. We just need to plant our feet and make it happen from the first snap to the last. If we play up to our talent level, I see a dominating win on Saturday night in East Lansing, and it doesn't get much better than that. Next week is our bye, so we'll only have one show for you. I'm hoping to have E.J. Holland from the Wolverine on 3 join us so we can check up on what's happening in our recruiting and, of course, talk about Saturday night's game in East Lansing. So make sure you come back next week. That will do it for now. Have a great Wolverine weekend, everyone. Think victory, beat Sparty. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Until we meet again, take care, and as always, go blue. Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V-Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. That's themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!